Section C 2021, let's get right on with question number 7, the first 25 mark question. So, evaluate the disadvantages of a significant increase in the national living wage on a specific labour market, such as that for social care workers. Now, straight away, this reminds me of exactly what Edexcel, the Edexcel examiners said in 2019, and I'll quote it perfectly. So in the summary of the paper in 2019, they said, spend time studying current developments in economics that are relevant to your specification. And this, again, I emphasize it a lot, but in 25 mark questions, you need that depth of application. You need to understand the real world of economics. To get the A's and the A stars, you cannot get away with just theory. You need a depth of knowledge in the real world application side. So you need to be able to link that theory, that theoretical understanding, to real world examples. There's quite a chunky stimulus it's given us here. Let's have a read of it. The national living wage, the minimum wage for 25-year-olds and over, is expected to rise to no more than £10.50 an hour in 2024 compared to £8.72 in 2020. This does not apply to self-employed or gig economy workers. Now that is a good mention there. Of course, it's not explicitly on the spec, but again, in the live classes, we do teach the gig economy since it has such a relevant link, especially with the real world of economics, to labour market. Some economists said that the increase was ambitious. The business groups warned that employers in sections such as social care, again, this is a great example, one that actually last year we taught in the live classes, could be hit hard. In the large parts of the north of England, the living wage has already reached 2/3 of the local median earnings, said this professor, which is actually a great start. And definitely these stimuluses, I would not underrate them. They can really help you pick up quite a few application marks, especially if you're going to talk about the example that is actually advised you to talk about, which is the social care sector. There's quite a lot of detail in the stimulus, and 100% try to utilise this. This is really easy application marks. They give you quite a few stats and figures. They contrast the new living wage compared to the old one. They tell you about the gig economy, which of course is not explicitly on the spec, but again, in live classes, why do we teach it? Since it has such a relevant link to the real world of economics, and in the real world of economics, one of the biggest things that is changing now is the gig economy and the new advancements with the gig economy. So definitely something well worth to learn. Also, here the question is referring mostly to the social care sector, then also towards the end talks about the north of England, basically regional inequalities and how the living wage has reached nearly 2/3 of local median incomes, which already thinking now could work as a really good evaluation for some of these paragraphs. But anyway, let's get started with planning the paragraph. Okay, let's get started with this first paragraph, and simply the easiest one, and the one I'm sure came to most of your minds, first things first, is of course just giving a little minimum wage analysis, since of course there is would be wage on this axis, on the y-axis, and quantity of labour on the x-axis, since of course the minimum wage diagram itself has quite a lot of analysis, can go quite into depth with it. Of course, where's the minimum wage going to be? It's going to be above the equilibrium wage, and you could call it minimum, or it's actually called living wage in this example. So P the living wage, and of course, what does this living wage lead to? Let's see. So this is now quantity demanded, this is now quantity supplied. So now there's a discrepancy between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And let's remember, in labour markets, who does the supplying and who does the demanding? Of course, us workers, households, supply their labour, and firms do the demanding. Firms demand the labour. Therefore, this excess supply, what does this also represent? What else can we call this excess supply? This is, of course, unemployment. And you could link this very well to something like government failure. Why is this government failure? The government intervene in the market. They set this living wage to try improve the allocation of resources. However, in reality, it leads to this excess supply. Of course, it's distorting like the price mechanism, but it leads to this excess supply, which means there's more unemployment, which actually could mean the government has made the allocation of resources worse than before. Therefore, you could define this as government failure. But we'll go into more depth with that paragraph later on. The second big paragraph I would write, which is quite interesting, and most students, I would say 90% of students, would do this paragraph because it's the most simple, it's the first one that comes to your mind. But the second one, which is a really great one, and one I always emphasize in the live classes for students to have a shot at, is now. So living wage, wages are increasing for firms, and wages are a cost for a firm. And what specific cost are they for a firm? Since we're talking specifically about wages, we would say this is a variable cost. Therefore, we have an increase in variable cost. Now, which diagram can we show an increase in variable costs on? Of course, we can show that on a cost/revenue diagram. Now, so we can shift our both, and of course, on a cost revenue diagram, which curves shift up when variable costs increase? You should know this by now. This is both MC and AC. So both your cost curves on a monopoly, on a cost revenue diagram, will shift upwards when you have an increase in variable cost. And this can be a really good diagrammatic analysis paragraph, including a lot of real world application. So actually we'll get started with this paragraph and then we'll finish off with this paragraph. Okay, so we said there's an increase in variable costs, and of course, first things first, the main points in our chain of analysis will be driven, and as they should be, by our diagram. So let's get this diagram drawn. So a cost revenue diagram, and let's get this drawn. So of course, very simple diagram for the start. So D equals AR, MR, AC, and MC. Okay, and now let's get this labeled up. Of course, labeling up the profit maximization point. MC equals MR. Pull down from there. Q mark. That's going to lead to this large box of super normal profit. Now, if a firm's variable costs increase, like we said, both MC and HC are going to shift upwards. And in this specific question, since I want to relate it a lot to the real world application, try to really base it around my real world knowledge, I am really going to emphasize that an increase in variable costs, since one of the largest costs for care homes, for social care firms, is wages. I think the statistic is around 60% of social care firms' costs are wages. So when wages increase, it has, when national living wage increases, it has a significant effect on these firms. Thus, and lots of social care firms, lots of care homes every year leave the market. They are forced to shut down since their costs are too large. So I'm going to try to represent that on this diagram. And how am I going to do that? Of course, my average costs are going to be higher than my price. Thus, that means I am higher than my shutdown point. So I've now crossed the shutdown point to the point at which a firm should leave the market. So how am I going to show that on the diagram? I'm of course going to show that by drawing my AC curve above my D equals AR curve. So that's AC1. Let's get in the new MC curve somewhere around there, which is MC1. Let's also get that new MC curve in, so MC1. So I've just made them red just to make them a bit clearer. So now let's use these new curves and work out the new profit maximization point. Of course, it's still where MC equals MR, but in this scenario now, it's where MC1 equals MR, which at this point there, we keep going up from that point until we hit our AR curve. Go left, which is now our new profit maximization point, which is Pmax1. But of course, we need to find our costs. How do we do that? We keep going up from this. We'll label this new Qmax1 quantity. We keep going up until we hit our AC curve. Now this gives us a box of what? A box, of course, our costs are now higher than our price. Therefore, this is a box of losses. Let's get started on how I would word this chain of analysis. So when you start, your point needs to be reusing as many words in the question as possible, since you want the examiner to understand you're directly addressing the question. So one disadvantage of a significant increase in the national living wage, as we can see from, and I'd quote this as application, from £8.72 in 2020 to £10.50 in 2024, is it will lead to an increase in a firm's costs. And what we show in this diagram, which therefore in the long run could lead to firms being forced to close down. As for example, and these are all stats we've learned and I've taught myself in the live classes. For example, in 2024, it's estimated that 20% of care homes are at risk of closing down, and there's around 300 care homes or social care places that close each year. So that's a really good way to get it started. Okay, let's keep going. So how would I actually start my chain of analysis now? So given my point, given my applications, how would I get started? So, and again, this is real world application just pays dividends here, and it's why the ASR students are just disproportionately, like, they're just on a different level compared to the rest of the candidates. But so around 70% of social care workers are on national living wage. This means the social care sector is highly exposed to wage floor increases. So any sort of change, any increase, like we can see here, from £8.72 to £10.50, like I said, around 70% of workers are on the national living wage. Therefore, any increase is going to significantly affect the sector. So when the government decides to increase national living wage from, like I said, £8.72 to £10.50, this is going to have a disproportionate or a massive effect, a great impact on these social care firms. And in the social care industry, in care homes, around 60% of all firms' costs are workers' wages. So it's a significant proportion of a firm's costs. Thus, when wages increase, you can label this, you can even draw a national living wage diagram just to label it up. So national living wage. So when national living wage increases, it therefore leads to, and since it's a significant proportion of a firm's costs, it therefore leads to a significant shift upwards of your MC and your AC, which we can of course relate to our diagram, thus causing our AC and MC shifting from AC and MC to AC and MC1, and then you can comment on the changes in the firm. So we've gone from a box of supernormal profit to now a box of effective losses. And of course, make sure to specify, remember, in your trade analysis, you assume your examiner has no content knowledge, you're being as step by step as possible. Don't just say a firm's costs increase, say when a firm's costs increase when MC and AC shift upwards, this could therefore lead to a firm's price being a firm's revenue being lower than a firm's cost. This would therefore mean in the long run a firm, these social care firms, these care homes, would be forced to close down as their costs are now higher than their revenue, therefore they cannot stay open, they are above their long run shutdown point. And to back that up, you could say around 300 care homes close each year. So everything I was saying verbally there, I have just typed it up. This took me quite a long time, so hopefully this is useful. Feel free to take a screenshot of this so you can refer back to it. But now, let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. So my first evaluation point, like I say in my most popular video on my channel, is the evaluation video. And I always say, question the assumptions. Economics, you're constantly making assumptions. And in this question, what have we assumed? One of the big things we've assumed is that when a firm's costs rise, so when the variable costs rise, it will mean that a firm's revenue is now lower than a firm's costs. So the firm's costs are higher, the revenue is lower, thus they'll be forced to shut down. However, that depends on how a firm sets its price. As for example, these social care firms, these care homes, when costs are rising due to wage costs rising also, they could respond to that increase in costs with an increase in prices. As for example, why was there such high levels of inflation? For example, 8 consecutive months of double-digit inflation during COVID times. That is because firms were experiencing a massive increase in costs, be it the Russia-Ukraine war, be it several factors that were causing their costs to rise. But how did the firms that survived respond? They responded by increasing prices. And when firms increase price, of course, that contributes to inflation as well. So the way I'd word this evaluation point, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which council social care firms rise prices in line with the rising cost. So the degree to which these social care firms pass the rising costs on to consumers, as you could also mention in this evaluation point, that definitely social care, adult care homes have a degree of inelastic demand. As for example, elderly, ill individuals, disabled individuals, they need quality care. Therefore, it means that since there's a degree of inelastic demand, how do you define inelastic demand? Is when consumers are not responsive to a change in price. Therefore, it's very unlikely that consumers will be responsive to the change in price, thus meaning, and the main thing, that these care homes, these social care firms, will be allowed to stay open since now their prices are representing the increase in cost. So that's how to word that first evaluation point. And secondly, a smaller evaluation point, but definitely very relevant, especially if you're keeping up with the healthcare side of economics. One big thing is that, of course, the government will help out. They will help these social care firms. Social care is necessary. Secondary care in the UK is necessary. Therefore, it depends on the degree to which, when national living wage increases, it depends on the degree to government subsidies, how the government helps these firms out to recover or help with their costs. So not the most developed evaluation point, but definitely if you're struggling with evaluation, one you can mention. So the last evaluation point I was thinking about is really developed, and it's surrounding the lines of depends on the degree to which a firm fosters efficiency improvements. As what is this new pressure? So the new pressure is an increase in national living wage. That is going to increase a firm's costs. And essentially what's going to happen in the market, firms that cannot respond to this increase in wage are going to be wiped out. The market is wiping out firms, and specifically the inefficient firms. The firms that survive will be the efficient firms. These will be the firms that are able to respond, that are malleable. For example, they may respond by trying to increase productivity in other ways. They may respond by trying to reduce their reliance on labour. For example, we said around 60% of social care homes costs are labour, but firms could, for example, invest into things like electronic monitors. Like you can get electronic blood pressure, just normal health monitors, which could decrease the degree to which these firms need labour. Thus, essentially what we're saying, it relates, of course, heavily relates to the concept of creative destruction, but firms that foster efficiency improvements will survive, whereas the firms that do not will not survive. And the way I'd word that valuation point really simply, it's a really interesting concept, especially for other questions, and especially creative destruction, essays on things like contestability. It's an absolutely great point to know about. But the way I'd word this evaluation point depends on the level of efficiency improvements. As for example, if a firm invests into something like technology or like electronic monitors on the residents' health, it could severely decrease the reliance on wages. Therefore, less of a firm's costs are reliant on wages, thus they're less affected by this increase in national living wage. And that will be more than enough evaluation for this first paragraph. Let's move on to the second paragraph. So let's get started with this second paragraph. Like I said, it is just going to be a simple minimum wage paragraph, since that is of course quite apparent for this question. So of course, like I said, wage on the y-axis, quantity of labour on the x-axis. Now you can do this in quite a few different ways. You can show the two changes in national living wage. So you can show from £8.72 to £10.50. You can show it like that, but very simply, I think this works quite well as well. Just talking about the new national living wage and just basing a chain of analysis upon this. And of course, the main thing in the chain of analysis is going to be the excess supply of labour. So this can be QD, this is going to be QS, and that is going to represent the excess supply, which of course is unemployment, since we're talking about labour market. And it is quite relevant here, I believe, to also just label up the equilibrium. So the way I would go about this chain of analysis is, firstly, one other disadvantage of a significant increase in the national living wage is it will cause unemployment. As for example, in the UK, the unemployment rate as of September 2025 is 4.7%. The labour market is originally at equilibrium at WE and QE. However, the government intervenes in this labour market, in labour markets in general, in all labour markets in general, as it believes that WE, the wage at equilibrium, is too low wage for its workers. It believes that it leaves the workers open to things like monopoly power, etc. Therefore, the government intervenes in the market. They set a national living wage, of course, which is wages for 21 individuals who are 21 and above. This wage is above the equilibrium wage, thus pushes wage up, and as we can see in the application, this pushes wage up to £10.50 in 2024. This new minimum wage leads to a disequilibrium. There is now a discrepancy between the quantity supplied of labour and the quantity demanded of labour. We can see this difference between QS and QD, and of course, which is excess supply, and excess supply in the labour market would be classed as unemployment. Thus, the government have intervened in the market to try to improve the allocation of resources for workers. They are making sure the workers are not underpaid, trying to increase workers' welfare. However, in reality, you could argue, due to the mass unemployment, due to the discrepancy between QD and QS, the excess supply, the government have actually worsened the allocation of resources, thus meaning there is a disadvantage of the increase of the national living wage. Very simple paragraph, but you can take a small chain of analysis and really extend it out. Use this chain of analysis as much as possible. Use a diagram as much as possible. Like I would say, use the diagram to drive that chain of analysis. And of course, for those of you who want to specify, just add a bit more detail into here, you can of course say this unemployment is in fact a specific type of unemployment, which you don't really hear about much anymore. It's more of a classical economist type of view, but it is of course real wage or classical unemployment, where the unemployment in the market has been caused by the wage artificially being increased, of course in this scenario by the government. Now you can leave the paragraph there, and that's a very justified, especially, and it all depends on timing, to be honest. Depends how much time you have left in your exam. But now, if you look at the end of this stimulus, it is actually quite interesting. It talks specifically about the north of England, and of course we know the regional inequalities in the UK, and it talks about how living wage has already reached 2/3 of the local median earnings. So how can I include this? So for example, in the social care worker industry, it reduces the incentive for these workers to become higher skilled, to progress in their careers. For example, become a nurse, as if the national living wage increases and we're already close to the median earnings in the north, it reduces the incentive and it compresses wage differentials, and that is the main thing. And if you compress wage differentials, there is no incentive there's limited incentive for workers to progress, to pick up higher skills, as essentially they don't really need to, they're not making much less by being lower skilled. Now that point isn't necessary, but it's a great point if you fully understand it. Moving on to evaluation, I'm going to keep it quite brief, and again it's going to be embedded in real world application. So essentially the way I'm going to evaluate this is talking about the turnover in social care industry, in the care home industry, as essentially the turnover of staff in this industry is extremely high. So in reality, the higher minimum wage does not actually cause excess supply, does not cause unemployment, as the problem in the social care industry is in fact there are not enough workers to fill the vacancies. So in reality, basically, is the exact opposite problem. And the higher minimum wage is actually helping solving that the problem with the vacancy. So the higher minimum wage is meaning more people are moving into the social care, the care home industry. So more workers are entering the industry. Thus, instead of actually worsening the unemployment, is actually improving the unemployment. So the way I would word this evaluation point is, however, in evaluation, this depends on how an increased national living wage is actually leading to improvements in employment in the care home social care industry. Essentially, the problem in the social care industry isn't the excess supply. The problem is the lack of individuals who want to go into social care. So there's way too many vacancies and there's not enough workers to fill those vacancies. So by increasing the national living wage, that is actually helping the social care worker industry, the social care industry, as it means workers are now more incentivized to enter the industry. So it's having the exact opposite effect. Instead of causing more excess supply, is actually increasing and helping employment. And of course, there's lots of evaluation points for this paragraph. You could talk about productivity, as for example, the increase in wages is of course going to lead to an increase in productivity, which could offset the decrease in employment. So you could actually get more output by less workers as workers' productivity increases. But yeah, we're going to leave it there for this 25 mark question.